Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Russia has demanded the downsizing of U.S. embassy staff within its borders in retaliation to new U.S. sanctions. How will the alleged Russian interference in Trump's election win dictate the president's next move? A great rhino is a new market term to describe a potential high-impact event that most people ignore. The term has already gained fans from China's National Conference on Financial Work. I speak to the woman who coined the term to find out if there are any great rhinos coming China's way. A diplomatic row between the U.S. and Russia has reached a tit-for-tat point. Russia has given the U.S. government up to September to cut hundreds of diplomatic staff on Russian soil. Russia is retaliating to a U.S. bill that would impose fresh sanctions on Russia. So how will the Trump administration handle this bill in light of investigations into the 2016 election is still anybody's guess.
Countdown to vacating embassy staff. Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a cut to hundreds of U.S. embassy and consular workers in Russia. The U.S. government will have to downsize its diplomatic staff in Russia by September the 1st. This represents the Russian government's retaliation to expected U.S. sanctions on Moscow. The sanctions bill is overwhelmingly supported by Congress and will halt Russian trade, coal exchange and people-to-people exchanges with the U.S.
We are just seeing a rise in anti-Russian hysteria. They are using Russophobia for internal political struggles. At some moment we will need to respond, because it's impossible to endlessly tolerate this kind of insolence towards our country.
The bill passed following an initial downsizing of Russia's diplomatic staff and asset confiscation in the U.S. during Obama's administration. The U.S. action is aimed at punishing Russia for alleged interference in the 2016 U.S. election, allegations Russia has denied.
A better relationship, the lifting of sanctions, will require Russia to reverse the actions that caused sanctions to be imposed in the first place.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
The sanctions bill blames Putin's administration for interference in Ukraine and Syria. Trump's administration has been compelled to engage in this tit-for-tat game with Russia. Critics say that Trump lifting these sanctions would prove that he was in debt to Russia for their help during the 2016 U.S. elections.
So has souring ties between Russia and the U.S. crossed the Rubicon, gone to a point of no return? Let's loop in our panelists. Join us from Singapore. We have from Russia originally Alexander Lukin, the Vice President of the Diplomatic Academy of Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, sir. And also in Washington, D.C., we invited Barry Pavel, who is a former special assistant to former U.S. President Barack Obama and a senior director for defense policy and strategy on the U.S. National Security Council staff. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. I want to ask you, Mr. Pavel, what do you make of President Trump's apparent silence so far toward the possible bill against Russia and, of course, Russia's retaliation so far?
Well, I think more broadly, his general silence compared to his lack of silence on other issues, in particular on the Twitter platform, is nothing short of baffling to most observers in Washington and probably around the world. It's really hard to understand. On one hand, you could make an argument that it's strategic. In other words, he lets, like other presidents, he lets his advisors, other senior officials play the bad guy, and then he gets to play, in some ways, the good guy and maybe close a deal on new arrangements in the future. But in general, it's baffling, and there's no end to the speculation and curiosity of this riddle of why President Trump, who is so vociferous on every other issue, including with China, is completely silent on this question of Russia's actions in the election and in Ukraine.
Mr. Lukin, though, the president in the U.S. still have the power to veto the bill. Of course, we see a majority of both of the House of Representatives and also the Senate have already approved it. So he's probably have to go through his really not too much political capital in order to do that. Do you think the Russian side would call on the U.S. president to do so, to veto the bill?
Well, first of all, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a political scientist, so I'm not sure what American president is going to do.
Okay,
and,
fair enough.
Secondly, Russia is not going to ask for anything because we are not dealing with personalities, we are dealing with a country. The president is representing a country, the Congress also represents the country, so whatever they do, we are going to deal with that. The thing is that, but as a political scientist, I can say that it's useless to veto the bill because you need 2/3 of the Congress to overrun it, and they have enough votes. So it's if he vetoes the bill politically, it would be just it will be overrun. It will be a humiliation for him, and there is no use. So I don't think that he's going to do it.
Many people are curious whether this is a real fight back by President Putin against the U.S. to reduce the number of the embassy staff inside Russia and also take away 2 properties for diplomatic uses by the United States in Russia, or actually it's just one of those gestures Russia would make to show to the United States what Russia would do. Mr. Lukin, what is exactly your interpretation? Real fight back or just a gesture?
Well, this answer was not an answer to the sanctions as such. This was an answer to what President Obama did before he left the office, when he expelled 35 Russian diplomats and also denied access to some Russian facilities. So this was an answer to that. And, but it was not direct answer, because Russia did not send back 35 people. It just the problem was not that. You know, with the United States, Russia had an agreement of 1992, which lifted limits to the staff of the embassy, of both embassies, and the United States violated it by denying visas for new Russian diplomats. When Russia wanted to send new diplomats in the place of those who were expelled, they denied the visas. So so Russia thought that they violated this agreement. So we said, if we don't have this agreement anymore, so we should have equal numbers.
Okay.
So we are going to have equal numbers. I think the number is 455.
All right, we got the record straight, at least from the Russian side. Mr. Pavel, of course, you work for the Obama administration. Earlier, your colleague, Mr. Lukin from Russia, suggesting it was in response to what the Obama administration was doing years ago.
Yeah, you know, I think it's better for the conversation here. There's so many issues to focus on the broad things, and in answer to your broad question, it's a gesture. I mean, this doesn't have a significant impact on the overall strategic relationship, although, as your reporter said, I think it will greatly, it could greatly affect the people-to-people exchanges and cultural and trade issues. So in some ways, it's a little bit of a shot in the foot for Russia, too, but I think there's bigger issues for us to discuss and for the 2 countries to discuss than this gesture.
All right. Let's focus on the bigger issue, which is really important. That is the relations between the United States and Russia. Will, as a result of President Trump's earlier approach of trying to create a more intimate relationship, now it's really bearing fruit, or rather going the other way, exactly the opposite? Your judgment here, Mr. Pavel.
Well, things are worse, clearly, since the end of the Obama administration. They're worse because of the repercussions of the Russian activity, whatever you want to call it. I call it an influence campaign, which is nothing new, but it just had new impact and new publicity. But I think they're worse because of the Russian influence campaign, and I think the way it's playing out, it's really Putin's. It's exceeding his highest hopes as a former intelligence officer, and so I think their relations aren't at their lowest point. They could go lower still. I could give you scenarios, but you know, this is a relationship that has its ups and downs. It's a wave, And right now we're heading down, but I imagine, there will be areas in the future, even in the first term, even in the next 3 years, where you could see it going up a slope, in particular as the Trump administration looks to be increasing pressure on China. I don't think it wants to sort of be picking fights with China and Russia at the same time, so perhaps one could see an opening for the U.S. and Russia to cooperate together in various areas, sometime in 2018, 2019.
Very interesting, your perspective, the triangle relationship. But Professor Lukin, do you believe in that?
You mean like what? Like that the United States is trying to pressure both countries at the same time? I think it's a pretty mindless policy, but this was also the policy of President Obama. So President Trump has not changed anything. He wanted to change. At least he said that he wanted to change. He said that he wanted to improve relations with Russia during the campaign. But I think that he didn't really understand how hard it would do, and he was not allowed to do it. And now he either doesn't want to, but I think it's more realistically to say that he is not allowed to. Because the entire elite, represented by the Congress, they just don't let him do anything. And the reason for these sanctions, for this bill, was actually more internal. The reason was that the Congress wanted to limit the power of the president. Now he cannot lift the sanctions by himself. So I'm not sure if he is able to do it in 2 or 3 years' time.
Yeah.
I don't think so. If we remember some other sanctions against the Soviet Union, they were there for like 20 or 30 years, and it took only the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right. Even after the collapse, we had to wait like 10 or 15 years. So I don't think that our relations can improve in the foreseeable future.
Mr. Pavel, you want to respond briefly about that?
Yeah, just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting that the sanctions would be lifted within 2 or 3 years, but I was suggesting that, we analysts and former officials tend to be not as good as we should be about predicting future trends in various aspects of international affairs. I include myself in that, and so I don't think you can rule out the chance of, we're heading down the slope now and relations are getting worse, right. But okay. You can imagine once things settle, different conditions, they could go up.
Well, very interesting discussion. And now we are joined by another guest coming originally from China. He is Mr. Yang Xiyu, who is the Senior Research Fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Mr. Yang, welcome to our program. Earlier, our 2 other panelists from Russia and the U.S. been talking about whether Russia-U.S. relationship are going to sway a bit because of U.S.-China relationship. What do you make of this triangle? Is it really a realistic triangle that we're talking about here?
Yes, there are indeed a strategic triangle already here in the international relations. However, it's not an equal triangle. With the worst and the worst of the relationship between Russia and the U.S., and the same worst direction happened in the China-U.S. relation. But that doesn't mean that will input the momentum for the improvement with Russia and the U.S. relation, because the contradictions and the differences between the Russia and the U.S. Were produced by their bilateral relation rather than by the China and the U.S. And basically, China-Russia relation will go through a stable and a cooperative shape. However, both U.S.-China and the Russia-U.S. will go through a difficult period.
I see. But I want to come back to some of the talking points earlier, Mr. Lukin and also Mr. Pavel. For example, what exactly is the nature of this relationship right now between the United States and Russia? What is going on with the diplomatic compounds, the cutting of the diplomatic staff? We all know that it's gesture. We all understand from both sides. But the important thing is, Professor Lukin, for example, from Russia, how much the U.S. is working with the countries in Europe and particularly in the neighborhood of Russia. We also heard the recent joint exercises with Georgia, and also we heard some of the other EU countries joined in. So exactly to Russia, what is the most important strategic interest that we are talking about here?
Well, we are still cooperating in some areas with the United States, like space research, for example, or several others. But generally, we have very low trade, almost insignificant, and so the main interest for Russia is strategic with the United States, like global issues. Because the United States is still the most powerful country.
Right.
As for Europe, I think that the United States is now much more comfortable with new members of the European community, the former Soviet bloc countries, like Poland and some others, Baltic states. But it's less and less comfortable and has more and more divisions with traditional Europe, with France, Germany, and actually these sanctions are also kind of directed against European business. So there is a lot of dissatisfaction in Europe about it.
On the other hand, Mr. Pavel, the United States still needs Russia in terms of, for example, Syria issue and some of the other strategic ones going on in the world. By the way, Russia, of course, in the permanent 5 of the UN Security Council, North Korea, some of the other issues, you need Russia's participation and even support. Mr. Pavel, how much do you think Washington will really drag away its relationship with Moscow? To what extent it will come back again? Of course, you're not good at predicting, you just mentioned earlier, but I do still want your assessment.
Well, the question you just answered, we could spend hours. I won't. But I mean, the kind of help, quote unquote, that Russia's been providing on Syria, on North Korea, on the UN Security Council, I don't think we need that kind of help. The Security Council is paralyzed. Syria is an unmitigated global disaster. Russia isolated itself on North Korea by saying that, well, we don't think that missile really was that significant.
Mr. Pavel, you don't need the support, or you think that you are not going to receive the support. Those are two very different things.
I'm saying Russia is in these fora and in these arenas, but they have been blocking solutions at every corner. And so that's why the UN Security Council has been paralyzed on Syria. That's why we have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dead Syrians.
Okay.
That's why we have mass migration into Europe. I could go on and on. So, I mean, it would be useful to have U.S.-Russia cooperation, and the lack of it has really made the world what we see today. It's a mess.
All right. Mr. Yang, what is your judgment here?
Well, the difficult relation between Russia and the U.S. will go a long period because of the fundamental differences between the two. But for China and the U.S. relation, I think the that will be stabler than Russia and the U.S. relation, although we have some difficult issues between the two. In short, Russia-China will go through a good shape, and Russia-U.S. will go more and more difficult period, and China, U.S. will go through a very mixed way, but basically stable way.
We'll see what's going to happen. Thank you so much. Yang Xiyu, Alexander Lukin, Barry Pavel. Really appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. Still to come on our program. A great rhino is a new market term to describe a potential high-impact event that most people dismiss. The term has already gained fans from China's National Conference on Financial Work. Right after that, in fact, I speak to the woman who coined the term to find out if China is tackling the great rhinos or not. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Great rhino is a term that has been attracting a lot of attention recently, since 2016. It means a probability of crisis. It's different from the black swan we talk about. That is very different to predict and usually causes negative market reactions. In contrast, gray rhino is more terrible than black swan, some say. Really? And there's also the elephant in the room, another animal that people use to describe what kind of crisis we're facing right now. To know more about exactly what's going on, take a look at this.
The gray rhino is a new theory coined by Michelle Walker at the Davos Economic Forum annual meeting in 2013. She also wrote a book on the theory that was published in the United States on April 2016. In the book, she pointed out that the financial storm from 2007 to 2008 was a black swan event for some people, but for most people, its occurrence was no accident. The market storm was completely the result of numerous gray rhinos converging. She believes that the gray rhino is a risk of great probability and high impact, which can be foreseen to some extent, but unfortunately, people don't pay much attention to it. In this way, the gray rhino will launch a ferocious attack. This theory is spreading to China. On July 16th, the term gray rhino appeared on the front page of China's official media, the People's Daily. When it comes to guarding against financial risks, it suggests to mind the black swan and gray rhino. At the end of July, the Office of Central Leading Group on Financial and Economic Affairs said that China needs to properly solve potential risks in the country's financial and property markets.
The gray rhino in the financial area included shadow banking, bubbles in property, illegal fundraising, and so on. China needs to figure out the situation and properly solve the issues one by one.
Even though the largest gray rhino in China is still unclear, China has time to make decisions before the gray rhino turns into the elephant in the room.
And for more, we invited Michelle Walker, who is the initiator of the gray rhino concept. Michelle, welcome to our program. Great to see you.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
The biggest danger is actually from the gray rhinos rather than from the black swan or the elephant in the room.
Yes, it's funny. I often describe the gray rhino as the love child of the black swan and the elephant in the room. And of course, the black swan is improbable. You can't even picture that it exists. It's also high impact. But because you can't picture it, it's very hard to really prepare for it. Then you have the elephant in the room, which by definition just stands there. Nobody says anything. Nobody does anything. And it normalizes the idea that people don't do anything and don't talk about problems, and that's not healthy. So I created the gray rhino because people were off looking for highly improbable things that they couldn't imagine, but so many of the problems that are right in front of us are the ones that explode. The systemic risks in the financial system, real estate bubbles. The most important thing is that the gray rhino gives you a choice. It says, unlike the elephant in the room, it's not a given that nobody's going to do anything. You have a choice, 3 choices actually. You can stand there and do nothing and get trampled, or you can just get out of the way and let it trample whoever's behind you and go do something else, no matter what the damage is. Or you can really work with the rhino, because many rhinos have power both directions. You look at digital media and the impact of technology. On the one hand, it's very damaging for companies that are not up to speed and are not aware of it and thinking about their responses. But for companies that really do embrace it and think about it proactively, the gray rhino is very much their friend. We want to figure out how we can solve the problem and, in many cases, profit from that.
What exactly is the gray rhinos that you can see in China?
Central banks all around the world used expansionary monetary policy to try to help economies to come back to life after the Great Crisis. But unfortunately, most of that money has gone into financial markets, into speculation, into real estate, and actually into rhino horn, where the price of rhino horn is in a bubble. And so a lot of the money that has been created by this monetary expansion all over the world, including China, but certainly not limited to, has created lots of benefit for speculators, but by one estimate, only a quarter of it has gone into the real economy to help to create jobs and to move things forward. That number may be higher in China than it is in the United States. The number that I read, the quarter, is referring to the United States. But really all over the world, you have this monetary expansion that has increased economic inequality, and that's what has led to a lot of the political upheavals we're seeing around the world.
That's right.
And in many countries, there's still not enough attention being paid to this gray rhino.
But you know, some of the things that you just mentioned, for example, about real estate, the Chinese government has been working very hard over the years to try to work on that specific issue, and yet it's contributing a lot to the GDP numbers, and it's also contributing to some of the very basic job creating areas in the Chinese economy. So it is easier said than done.
The rest of the world, I think right now, is leaning too much on China to drive global economic growth. And I think for China, it's worth looking at where the bubbles are in the economy and where resources are being directed well. For example, in Beijing recently, someone told me, you know, the apartments are as much as other cities around the world in much wealthier countries, but people are making much less. So here are these overpriced apartments and buildings, and people don't have access to a place to live. That's a very big problem, and the run-up in real estate prices has been much more recent. And so I think whenever you see a rapid rise in any financial asset, that's something that should set off alarm bells, as it rightly has in China.
Chinese enterprises investing extensively overseas, one that is being encouraged by the Chinese government, and it is also a necessary step for Chinese businesses becoming global. On the other hand, there is, in some cases, the danger of over-investment, of extensive investment without much business model in the making. So, Michelle, what do you make of this issue?
I think the big danger with some of the rapid expansion overseas is when it's being funded by debt. We've been in a very low interest rate environment around the world for a decade now, and that's not going to continue forever. And in countries that are very much driven by credit and debt, the more you have, the more dangerous it becomes. And the sooner you say, hey, let's hold back a little bit, let's be a little bit more conservative, the better off you are in the long run. So I think that's really the big danger in the rapid expansion. And the other big danger is that there often, in many cases, are different companies in the same area competing with each other, lots of speculation, lots of froth. At some point, something's going to give, and these companies are going to have to consolidate. So looking a bit ahead at what could happen if the business plans don't go as well as is hoped is very important. To look at the middle scenario and the negative scenario, as well as the optimistic, positive scenario, and be sure that you're prepared for those as well.
On the other hand, we have also seen, Michelle, some of the interesting slogans going on in China. Earlier, there is anti-corruption drive. The drive is going against all the big tigers and also the flies, meaning the big officials and also low-level officials who are corruptive. And now you see a new term, which is called financial crocodile, talking mainly about some of the big financial institutions or entities trying to make deals with big danger that's likely to impact the national economy in the near and even mid-term future. What do you make of terms like this? How big is the danger facing China right now? How imminent is this danger?
Well, I just love the way that these animals can stand in as ways to trigger emotions.
Oh, a zoo is quickly created.
It's fantastic. Well, you know, throughout history, throughout folklore, you have Aesop's fables. Every single culture has stories with animals that are used to illustrate human characteristics. And I think it's easier to see something if we're talking about an animal than if we're talking about humans, because looking at something different from you, you can see flaws that you might not see if you're just looking in the mirror. So I'm absolutely delighted to see this financial menagerie growing. You know, I think that one of the criteria for judging how dangerous is a gray rhino is how fast is it coming at you. As I mentioned a moment ago, if you see asset prices go way up over a short time, you're going to have trouble. In the early 2000s, I had an apartment in Manhattan that nearly doubled in value in 4 years, and I sold it. It was quite obvious that something was not quite right there. So I think the question is, you know, how fast is it moving? How extensive is it? What's the potential big impact? How interconnected is it? If one company fails, is it going to make other companies fail? I think a lot of the trouble in the United States with Lehman Brothers was that it was so connected, and that AIG insurance fell as a result. And so many companies that had ties to Lehman Brothers had trouble because it went down. So these too big to fail banks, companies, other institutions are in general quite dangerous and deserve an extra amount of scrutiny to be sure that they are not putting everybody else at risk. And in the United States, we've got a problem where you've got the privatization of profit and the socialization of risk, that people expect that when they make money in the markets, they'll get all the gains, but that if they crash, the government will step in and the taxpayers have to bail them out. And that's an imbalance that certainly we need to correct in the United States.
It's certainly great advice for any decision maker in whether companies or governments. But on the other hand, why rhinos are not being taken care of? Why no measures have been taken by those who eventually face the elephant in the room before it becomes the elephant in the room, which is great rhino? That's because people want to take the chance. Some even say, when there's no crisis, don't try to tend it. We heard that over and over again in business world for many years. So are you saying we should change the overall way of doing things? And will there be too many great rhinos for us to ravel all at the same time?
Prioritizing rhinos is very important. And at some point, some of them, you're going to have to say, all right, let it trample this. This isn't important. This is an obsolete technology. This is an old way of doing business. We need to focus on what's going to move us forward. So that's very important. And I do think people need to change the way that they do things. There are different reasons why we don't deal with gray rhinos. One of them is psychological. Humans have all sorts of cognitive biases that mean that the decisions we take are not always as rational as we'd like to think they are. For example, there's the availability bias. Whatever is most prominent in your emotions is probably what you're going to think is most probable. So we're really not very good at dealing with a good analysis of costs versus benefits, of the likelihoods of just different risks happening. And I think that's why a lot of companies get in trouble. You look at some of the biggest corporate gray rhinos in the United States. You look at General Motors with its ignition switch that they knew was faulty. The switch cost 57 cents, and they knew about it to the highest levels of the company and still didn't do anything about it. And it cost the company billions and billions and billions of dollars because they didn't deal with it. Similarly, the Takata airbags or the Wells Fargo fraudulent accounts, things that have been going on for years and years. And if the company had dealt with it at the time when it discovered it, it would not be in the situation that it is now, even going back to Enron. So some of the biggest corporate disasters we've seen are the result of seeing a gray rhino and not doing something about it. So that takes us to the decision-making process and how you evaluate the likelihood something's going to happen, how you evaluate what the impact is going to be, what the cost-benefit is. And that comes to what kind of voices are you listening to around the table. Is everyone from the same background? You know, a board full of all lawyers is going to think like lawyers, whereas if they think like engineers or like marketers or other disciplines, they're going to come up with different questions, better questions, and they're going to be able to arrive at a much better answer. But most decision-making bodies, whether it's corporations or even many governments, tend to come from one small sector and one set of expertise, and that kicks in something called confirmation bias. That if someone who's like you in a room of people just like you says something, you're much more likely to nod your head, even if you disagree with them. And obviously this is a big cultural challenge. So I think that the Gray Rhino can help in this way. It can make it okay to talk about something that's scary and that people don't want to talk about. So if you look at the people who are giving you advice and answers and helping you to decide, make sure that you've got the right perspectives in the room. And then if you regularly ask yourself, what's the Gray Rhino? If you make that just part of and having a structured conversation about it, you're actually going to have a much better chance at not getting trampled than companies who don't do that.
You know, in retrospect, any kind of theories could work as long as they are good with good intentions, even with these beautiful theories of gray rhinos. And yet, when it comes to decision making, we all know there are so many factors that are contributing. You only mentioned some of those. So will they be benefiting, I mean, the decision maker, as long as they know this, the gray rhinos, they know the elephant in the room, and they know the black swan? Will they really be helped with their sound decision making?
Well, I think it's what I call necessary but not sufficient. Beyond the psychological factors for decision making, there are all sorts of other incentives. You know, somebody might be getting paybacks from their partner. They might have invested in an industry that they see as something that could benefit them by hanging on to an old way of doing things, and they'll just try to milk it, to drag it out as long as they can. So each person has a different set of interests. Each policymaker has a different set of interests and incentives. Many people are much more motivated by the short term than by the long term, even though there's research showing that for the most valuable companies, the biggest part of the value by far comes from long-term investments, long-term value, and long-term thinking. So that's something else you've got to look at. Where are the incentives? And in some cases, somebody's going to make a very logical choice and say, hey, I'm going to go with the short-term decision, and I'm going to let the Gray Rhino trample other people, and then I'll just hop out of the way. So that's a very big problem. But I feel that the Gray Rhino is a minimum for starting to change some of that.
I see.
That you may not be able to solve things right away, and it's a very long process. But if you are recognizing the Gray Rhino, and if you are looking at what are the competing interests and why did we make the decisions that we did, you're way ahead of somebody who's not even thinking about Gray Rhinos.
Michelle, right before we come into the studio, I tried to look for other articles you've been writing related to Gray Rhinos, and I noticed just exactly 1 year ago you wrote a story about Donald Trump, but then at the time was still the candidate Trump, and you describe him not as Rhino, which is, you know, the way you describe the Republican, but rather as a Gray Rhino. Do you think that analogy still stand? Does that in any way challenge your already existing theory about the Gray Rhino? He is becoming really the president of the United States, and the voters did vote for him.
There was a much bigger Gray Rhino, which was the motivations behind people voting for someone who has said things in public that didn't show the best judgment, who had been bankrupt many times. I lived in New York for 23 years, and that's how we always thought of him. Someone who spoke out in very, very disturbing ways against minorities. And what was it that was leading the American people to support someone like that? And that goes back to the inequality gray rhino that I spoke about a little while ago, and to some of the economic changes that were happening that were not being addressed. And the truth is, if Donald Trump and Congress don't look at that big gray rhino, we're going to see another big, huge turnover, and it could be even more frightening than what we've seen already.
I see. Thank you so much for being with us. Learned a lot. Really appreciate it,
Thanks
Michelle.
for having me.
Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again tomorrow for insights across China and around the world. Good night.